let's talk about your article about the war in Ukraine. The title is "To End the War in Ukraine, Expose Its Core Lie." In your opinion, what's the problem with this war in Ukraine and what's its core lie?
There are many problems, but one of the core elements that is being used to prevent a discussion even of the possibility of ending the conflict through negotiations is the a priori assumption that Putin intended in his invasion to conquer all of Ukraine, which I think any military analyst would say is demonstrably false. At least I found that most military analysts agree on one thing, that Russia did not invade in February 2022 with enough forces to conquer all of Ukraine. And then they debate amongst themselves, was it a lack of foresight? Was it stupidity? Was it overconfidence? Those are all possibilities. But I also suggest that another possibility is that he did not intend to conquer Ukraine, but which would be more in conjunction with what he actually has said, to pressure Ukraine to recognize the independence of the Donbas region. Subsequently, the mission expanded when it became obvious that Ukraine was not going to submit to those demands. And then I suspect, or it seems that the military posturing began to consolidate a regional connection from Donbas through down to Crimea. So the two additional regions were taken over by Russia. And subsequent to that, there seems to be, there was actually an effort to stop the Ukrainian advance, dig in, and once the Ukrainian advance halted, which it seems to have run out of steam, now we will be entering a new phase in the military fighting. We don't know how what will happen exactly, but a lot of military analysts are predicting some sort of Russian counteroffensive. And it seems logical, again, to assume that depending on how successfully that goes, the political demands of made by Russia will adapt to those possibilities. I've always said from the very beginning, I'm not a military expert, but it has always been obvious that the political resolution of this conflict will depend on the outcome of the battlefield conflict, whatever that is. And if it turns out one way, then Ukraine will have the upper hand in the negotiations. If it turns out the other way, Russia will have the upper hand in the negotiations. Probably the worst of all possible worlds is for no one to have the upper hand and think that if they just fought a little longer, things will turn their way. And that as a result, simply more people die without any measurable impact, without any ability to get to a quicker conclusion, which is what we all hope for, an end to the fighting. And what I talked about in my article is that this mindset that Russia was pursuing something that it was obviously not pursuing based on its military placement is now being used as an argument as to why one can never negotiate with Russia. And that's just self-defeating, and it's a self-defeating and self-limiting position toward negotiations, which again is not substantiated by the actual placement and military deployment.
We heard that Antony Blinken said it repeatedly that Russia wants to subsume, not only subsume Ukraine, but just march toward Europe and conquer European countries. When it comes to this type of thinking, in your opinion, why he was trying to picture Russia like this? And is that logical that Russia wants to march toward Europe and conquer Europe?
I don't think it is logical, and there is no rhetorical evidence that you can find in official Russian statements to support that. But we shouldn't take the words of our opponents at face value. We also have to consider, are they doing anything to support that kind of attack? And I don't see anyone arguing that really they are. What they are saying instead, and what Blinken is counting on without actually explicitly saying so, is that the assumption, if Russia wins this battle in Ukraine, then maybe it will be tempted to move further. I don't see that as very logical, because Russia will at that point have accomplished all of its objectives, whereas expanding further would only threaten those accomplishments, which were hard won. So it would seem to me very foolish on the part of the Russian leadership to, having accomplished what it set out to do, basically secure the territories that it now has under its control in Ukraine, to then threaten that by expanding further and attacking NATO or any NATO country. I'm leaving aside for the moment the question of, does it make sense to push further into Ukraine? Because there's I think a reasonable debate. People can reasonably debate about that. One could argue that Russia would have an interest logistically to press further into Ukraine, mainly in order to pressure Ukraine into negotiating, into accepting what Russia has taken. Beyond that, however, I think it becomes much less logical to push into Ukraine. In other words, it would only make sense to do so as a political tactic to encourage negotiation. Because taking all of Ukraine, especially the regions that have very little historical and cultural and religious sympathy for Russia, which is the Western regions, would just be an undertaking of an entirely different magnitude than what Russia initially set out to accomplish. So one could envision a lot of different scenarios here. But the one that makes sense at this point is that if Russia were to establish that it has battlefield dominance, that Ukraine is in a weakened position and is unlikely to recover because the United States and its allies have essentially, without officially saying so, withdrawn their support from it by not providing the aid that Ukraine actually needs, which is the current situation. Ukraine is therefore forced to recognize this reality and to sit at the negotiating table. With American and Western support, it might be able to get somewhat better conditions than if it did so alone. But it does seem important to the West that Ukraine makes this decision. I think the Western rhetoric on negotiations has shifted rather significantly. At the time that the Istanbul Accords were being talked about, Boris Johnson went to Ukraine and insisted that no matter what Ukraine might want, the West was not prepared to give up this fight, and the West wanted this fight. So it essentially vetoed Ukraine's willingness to negotiate any peace proposal. Today, the rhetoric is much more subdued. We will not oppose whatever Ukraine decides to do, but we will not pressure them to make concessions. So that's the rhetoric, which essentially could mean anything is happening behind the scenes. We have no idea. But there's been speculation, wide speculation in the Western press, that in fact there is a lot of pressure being put on Kiev to negotiate something, and that if they don't, well, one of the consequences is that Western support is de facto being withdrawn, no matter what the official rhetoric says.
Considering this rhetoric of the United States that if Russia takes Ukraine, then they're gonna march toward Europe. In your opinion, did the European leaders buy this kind of rhetoric, or they just wanted to get aligned with Washington, no matter what it is?
I think that depends on the individual leader and what they believe. There is always a conditioning factor now, which is that the rhetoric of the West, and particularly of NATO countries, has been so extreme that to walk back from that will be a very obvious concession. Everybody will point to it and say, well, were you lying to us then, or were you lying to us now? Western publics and media and journalists will obviously point to that discrepancy. So it's difficult for them to do that. On the other hand, we know from the occasional leaks that have occurred and from gaffes that have occurred, like Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister or president of the Council of Ministers, got into a discussion with two Russian pranksters. Whereas her public rhetoric has been, we're supportive, we're behind Ukraine, we're NATO, and we're there all the way, to these Russian pranksters who portrayed themselves as, I forget what, political leaders, but not Russians. She said, yeah, we're all very tired of this and wish it would go away. I think that is probably a very common sentiment among political leaders, no matter what they say publicly. But it is a problem for Western political leaders that they cannot tell the truth to their own publics for fear of suffering political repercussions, and it limits the ability of diplomacy to begin and to help resolve this problem.
Just recently, Emmanuel Macron said that if Russia wins, it would be a huge security problem for Europe. In your opinion, how they can define the European security without Russia? Because it seems to me that Russia is part of this security.
Right. And Macron himself has said so as well before. So a statement like that sounds very powerful. But when you think about what it actually means and what he did not say, as well as what he said, you realize that it's more posturing than anything else, because he can both believe that Russia needs to be part of a pan-European security system or arrangement, and feel simultaneously that a Russian victory would indeed be a threat because it diminishes the credibility and effectiveness of NATO. Both of those are true. And he's just saying one now and another a few weeks earlier. But those are not mutually exclusive propositions. They're just hard to listen to and hear said at the same time. And so that's what politicians do. They find the appropriate audience to say one thing and then another audience to say another thing. And Macron is, I would say, masterful at being able to say many important sounding things that actually don't amount to very much in the long run.
When it comes to Europe right now, it seems that in the United Kingdom, in Germany specifically, it's a huge change in Germany that they're thinking of fighting Russia. When I look at Europe today, I think, what's happening to Europe? Are they losing their sanity?
Two things. First of all, there have always been bellicose voices, what we in America call neoconservatives, have their counterparts in European politics and in European elites. There are neoconservative think tanks in Germany, and there are political forces who have are very keen to build a transatlantic relationship, if necessary, at the expense of a eastward relationship. And they have been opposed by people who say, have said in the past, that the German-Russian relationship is actually a more important foundation for European security than the transatlantic relationship could ever be. The problem today is that the political leadership in Germany, which is losing popularity, I think partly because of the position that they're taking on this war and the impact that it has had on the German economy. The political leadership has taken such an extreme position in public that it cannot walk this back. And that's why politicians need to remember that it is very important not to say too much, not to commit to too much, but to always have the leeway. I mean, one of the things, you can disagree with everything that Putin does, but you have to acknowledge that in terms of his ability to manipulate and pressure his adversaries into revealing what they think, he plays the game as it should be played, which is Putin says very little. As a result, when he says something, you know it's authoritative. For the most part, however, you have a number of subordinate actors, very close, known to be very close to him, like the head of the National Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, who takes much more extreme positions now. And he says something, and people pick it up in the news in the West and comment on it. Putin says nothing. That way, you have established a sort of outer boundary for what Russia is willing to consider, but you haven't committed Russia itself to that position. And we in the West are left guessing which of these is the closer position or the more accurate reflection of the Russian elite. And the problem in the West has been that there's too much consistency among NATO leaders on the need to punish Russia. And as a result, there's no alternative sane voice that can say, but although in principle that sounds right, let's find out by reaching out and making certain proposals what they would accept. That diplomacy has become impracticable in the West. And Putin has pointed this out and said, look, we're ready to negotiate. Who wants to negotiate with us? Nobody. And that's a problem, because on the one hand, we have a tremendous inconsistency, which is the West, rhetorically, Western leaders say, well, we all understand that this will be a negotiated settlement and that there will finally be a negotiation that will have to be reached. And at the same time, they don't endorse these negotiations. So they seem to be literally speaking out of two sides of their mouth, which of course highlights the very inconsistency in the Western position that Putin is always talking about and getting recognition for identifying throughout the third world, throughout the global South and neutral areas.
In your opinion, if Russia goes on offensive in 2024 and it turns out to be successful in Ukraine, how would that affect the Biden's position in the presidential election?
Well, it would not be good. because he would be blamed, as many American politicians have been blamed in the past, when they committed to support democratic China in 1949, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Of course, the opposition says, well, you said you would do this, and you failed. You failed to think it through. You failed to execute what you promised, and your whole policy has been a failure, and you're a failure as a political leader. That's unavoidable. But there's also, I would say, no way that the Biden administration, through any actions that I can conceive of, can change that outcome if Russia decides that it wants to pursue an offensive. As a matter of fact, on this very point, sadly for the United States and the American elections, Russia this time could really have a serious impact on the outcome, because it can time a potential offensive to have the most damaging effect to the current Democratic administration, if it wanted to do so, if it thought it worth doing.
There was some sort of difference and discussions within the Zelensky administration, and recently Zelensky tried to dismiss Zelensky. When it comes to these sort of problems in Ukraine, how much the Biden administration has the upper hand to control these kind of problems in Ukraine?
The problem of American influence in Ukraine, which is significant, is the same as the problem with American influence in Israel and any other country. On the one hand, there is this influence because of the amount of money invested and the assumption, which is a correct assumption, that that country wants to continue to receive assistance, intelligence, military support, alliances, and to be an ally of the United States. On the other hand, no political leader ever is going to agree to those benefits at the expense of his own political career. So there is an inherent limit, and it is simply not feasible, short of a military coup orchestrated by the United States. And I was reminded earlier today that the CIA has apparently organized, according to its own records, 54 such military coups of governments that it wanted to replace with more sympathetic governments. But I mean, that's a possibility. But the problem then is simply shifted onto the next person. So that person is our man in Kiev or anywhere else, until that person develops his own power base, and then the powers that he needs to conduct his own policies in Ukraine eventually run into conflict with somebody in the American administration, and a rift develops, and the same problem arises. Sovereignty is either respected or not respected. And I think the United States is limited inherently, any country, but even the United States as the most powerful country in the world is in reality significantly limited in the amount of influence it can have in day-to-day decision making in any foreign country.
When you look at the European Union policy in Ukraine and in Gaza, you see a huge difference, considering that their national security, their regional security was at stake when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, when it comes to how significantly the Germans' economy was dependent on Russian energy. But you don't see any disagreement with the Biden administration policy in Ukraine. But when it comes to Gaza, it's totally different. They talk against the war in Gaza. They even criticize the Netanyahu administration, but we can't see such a thing in Ukraine and the Zelensky's attitude in this war in Ukraine.
First of all, I think there is more diversity in European politics than we see portrayed in in our local media. The governments that are in power have taken a very supportive position in line with that of the United States. But that policy, I've suggested, is not necessarily popular throughout the country. And especially, it seems, has led to losses for the Greens and the Social Democrats, the two pillars of what they call the traffic light coalition in Eastern Germany and in a few regions also of Western Germany. So what is the policy of the German government today may not be the policy of the German government tomorrow, which is exactly what happened in Slovakia, by the way, more or less overnight. So all of these chickens, as we like to say in America, will come home to roost. And we can't anticipate what the outcome will be. Right now, I would say there are 3 reliable countries that would actively oppose NATO membership for Ukraine, which are Turkey, Slovakia, and Hungary. And Slovakia is already on record with prime ministers having said that. Austria is not a big fan either, although they're a neutral country. But the EU has its own disagreements. And again, there is not any significant unanimity today, given the way the war has unfolded, on supporting Ukraine to the extent that it was supported a year ago. And the reason for that is not just that some people argue the cause may be hopeless. Others, however, are actually more specifically worried about how much money it will cost, and it will cost all the other programs that all these governments want to implement. And now they're being asked to shift resources from the policies that they wanted, that they ran to support, and that their electorate are expecting them to support, into defense. Now, in Britain and a couple of other countries, Germany, now we see a propaganda campaign being ramped up by the military there to say, well, we are at an impasse now. We can't spend the money that we need to get the kind of defense that we want. So we are going to be unleashing an anti-Russian, essentially, campaign for military buildup in Britain and in Germany. They both, the military leadership in both countries has promised that. That's not easy to do. And it takes time for it to sink in. And there will be elections before it has gone through. And the elections I don't know about when they might occur in Britain, but in Germany, I think they're much closer to elections than in Britain, probably. And in that case, I don't think that the issue of the election will be, should we support Ukraine further? Is it sensible for Germany to do that? Is that Germany's future direction? A militarized Germany, a Germany that gives up on being, gives up on reaching out to Russia and including it and being in European security and being a reliable partner for Russia? or can we recapture that? This is, I don't know what the outcome will be. It'll be a very contentious debate, and it could go either way, I think, at this point.
When you look at the war in Ukraine, after 19 months of this conflict, it seems that the goal of NATO was to weaken Russia. It seems to me that it's not working for them that way that they want it to be. They're not considering that this policy isn't working, but they're not accepting it. What's the problem here? Is it coming out of arrogance? It's coming out of just neglecting the reality on the ground?
Well, it's partly what you talked about, arrogance, particularly in the statements of people like David Cameron, the new British foreign minister, who just said, well, look, we outspend the Russian economy 25-1. We have to win. It just cannot be any other way because the math for him predicts that. He just cannot conceive of any other outcome. And that's part of perhaps an imperial mindset from previous colonial times. And you know what the metropole can do and the colonies and backward regions cannot. Another is, I keep coming back to this, the box that politicians put them in by taking political stances consistently that exclude any other possibilities. So they limit themselves, they burn their own bridges. And now, how can they go back to their electorate without appearing incompetent and foolish? They can't. And very few politicians are willing to sacrifice their careers, even for the national interest. And lastly, there's a problem that I've heard discussed a lot in the United States with the Biden administration. And it may be true given the nature of power generally, is that political leaders don't want to hear bad news. So it never gets to them. So the Biden administration, there's been a lot of reporting on this. People come in and try to tell the president or senior advisors, it's not going the way we thought it would go. Perhaps we should re-examine the policy, and they're not invited to the next meeting. Nobody wants to hear the bad news, and the president, therefore, and his advisors remain ignorant and isolated from reality. You'd be surprised, I think a lot of people would be surprised, how little outside information actually gets up the chain of command to the top. I worked briefly in the State Department and participated in the construction of certain briefs for the Bush White House, the Bush Senior White House, on meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev. And we at the lower levels were expected to be aware of the reporting that was done. But we also had internal sources coming from intelligence or diplomatic sources that would elucidate what the background was or why this was important or why this was not important. But then it was all filtered through people like myself or a handful of people. And out of a 3 to 5 page paper, it was a very big deal in the State Department. I was congratulated on this when one sentence of that made it into the president's nightly briefing. And you know, this president is not the youngest, doesn't maybe stay up as late as some others. And I know that when I'm tired and I have a stack of papers to go through at the end of the night, I don't necessarily read it very carefully. And I can imagine that my one sentence didn't make any impression at all on the people that were supposed to, on the president or anybody else who was supposed to read it. So the nature of information at the top is that it has to be repeated time and time and time and time again, first of all. And secondly, that sadly, the people who are most knowledgeable often are not consulted, but the people who are listened to as knowledgeable are people who write opinion pieces for the New York Times who have never been to the country, but have an opinion to share with the world, and because it's in an influential outlet, or because they have a voice and have a podium to speak nationally or on television about this, that's what the administration has to respond to, not to the actual information that is provided to them by their own assets on the ground in that country. Sadly, that's been the experience, and I'm pretty confident that any Foreign Service officer would confirm that.
When you look at Putin's attitude since he took power in Russia, he was always willing to have a better relationship with European Union and United States. Whenever he tried to get better relations, it was perceived as Russia is weak. Russia is not that powerful. When you look at Obama's statement, he said Russia is a regional power. What was the problem that they couldn't get along with each other?
I think it is an attitudinal problem of an elite in the United States that assumes that it has the right to dominate and dictate the course of the future to those that it has beaten. And the assumption, Ambassador Jack Matlock, our last ambassador to the USSR, makes this point very cogently and has said it repeatedly. The Soviet leadership and the Russian leadership subsequently did not feel that they lost the Cold War. They felt that they made a vital contribution to the peaceful transition from a hostile relationship with the West to a peaceful relationship with the West. And their counterparts in the West didn't see it that way for the most part. A few did, like Ambassador Matlock, George F. Kennan, I think, the real knowledgeable people who dealt with Russian and Soviet American relations for decades, understood that the United States did not suddenly, or as a result of any particular policies, win the Cold War, but that it was a joint effort on the part of the West and Russian liberals, Russians who wanted reform. But those Russian reformers did not want a weakened Russia. They didn't see Russia as a subordinate to Western interests. They simply wanted the same deal that maybe Germany, another defeated power, if you will, or France even, or Italy, got after World War II, to be part of a new security alliance on equal terms. And that was never offered to them because they couldn't enforce it. The thinking in the West was Russia has been defeated. We no longer have to pay attention to anything they say or anything they want, ignoring one of the most intelligent dictums that Henry Kissinger ever stated, which was that it's important to remember that no great power is ever defeated forever, never retreats forever. It will always come back and demand what it considers its just due in the world. And really, that's what we're seeing unfold in this confrontation with the West over Ukraine. At least from Russia's perspective, they are not fighting Ukraine, or they wouldn't like to be fighting Ukraine. But what they are fighting for is for an independent Ukraine separate from the West, one that can, in fact, reach a reasonable accommodation with Russia rather than be a total puppet of NATO and a constant thorn in Russia's side, and not just a thorn in its side, but a real, as Russia believes, a real security threat to its existence.
If they want to have some sort of negotiations with Russia and getting better in terms of their relation, their future, do they have any better option than Putin? Seems to me that Putin would be the best option possible.
I think there's two ways to think about this. The more fanciful way, which I guess is the assumption of some Western leaders that want to continue this war, is that Putin will be shamed by his defeat. Putin will then have to leave the scene politically. This will discredit not just him, but his entire policies. And in the vacuum that ensued, someone better, we have no idea who, but someone better will rise, and then we will begin to deal with him, with this new political leader, and entice them into some sort of better relationship with the West. This is built on an extraordinarily large number of ifs and suppositions, none of which seem to have any plausible basis. There's no one in the wings. There's no political movement that would suggest that it is eager to re-engage with the West. None of this is even remotely visible today in Russia. So I think your point is well taken, which is, if you look at it from a practical political position, you would want to negotiate with the political leader who can guarantee the outcome that you want, which is the most powerful political leader. If you have a weaker political leader, then while you may get that political leader on your side in the negotiations, that person will be weakened domestically by his rival. Well, exactly the same situation you see in Ukraine today. So it would be easier to reach a settlement with Putin, although Putin being strong would not be a settlement that would be easily swallowed by the West or Ukraine.
The recognition of this, that Putin can be a trustful negotiator, do you think, can we have this under Trump if Trump wins?
The current rhetoric in the West about Putin is very much like the rhetoric, it fits in with the rhetoric that Russia is bent on invading and conquering Western Europe. It's of the same cloth. So you only have to state that as a given, and take it for granted. I would say Western biographers of Putin prior to 2014, and a number even after that, have by contrast highlighted Putin's trustworthiness, his commitment to his word, and his reliability. And again, I would highlight in this regard Ambassador Jack Matlock's book, Superpower Illusions, where he describes Putin's character in some detail and stresses how important it is for him personally, both to be seen as trustworthy and in negotiations with others to trust in what other people are saying to achieve an achievable result, to achieve a result of any kind. So that's all, that the situation there. With respect to the election, I don't think it'll be any different. I think a Trump presidency will not differ substantially in foreign policy from any other presidency that the United States has gone through in the past several decades. That's because there is, in fact, an elite consensus on America's mission to the world, that America is an exceptional country, not bound by the rules that other nations are bound by, that it has a mandate from heaven to rule over the West and to be the guiding symbol for other nations, a city upon a hill. And there is no political candidate today left who espouses any other interpretation of America's role in the world. So Trump's rhetoric notwithstanding, there is no one that he can tap plausibly to be any member of cabinet, any Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense who could say anything but that. So don't expect a change in American foreign policy for the better, would be my advice.
Piers Morgan did an interview with Bill Clinton on CNN. When he asking him about Putin, he says Putin in all his meeting with Clinton was so honest and so direct, and he was so blunt about everything. He kept all his promises. This is the president of the United States talking about Putin during his term when he was working with him. But when this war in Ukraine started, this campaign of Putin, whatever Putin says is a lie, and he's a pathological liar. When you see the president of the United States say something and the media starts saying differently, how do you put these two together, and why they're doing this, and how successful was this?
You know what? There's a saying in American politics. Do you know when you can tell if a politician is lying? When their lips move. So the idea here is that politicians always lie, depending on the context that they have to support. They are brought up, the American politicians, perhaps others as well. I don't want to say it's only American politicians, but a populist political environment like the United States, in which the individual is everything and the political party is almost irrelevant ultimately to the success of that candidacy. In that kind of political environment, the individual candidate has to go to 5 different constituencies and say 5 different things that they all want to hear to get their vote. They can't possibly be consistent in what they say. So they either say nothing and just generic platitudes. I will make America great again. We must stand tall and look far and be powerful. Or they say things that are almost implausible in their realization. Things like, yes, we will build a border wall, and it'll go up in 6 months, and meanwhile, of course, no one is planning on this. No one has spent any money on this. It occupies just a tremendously small part of a very long border of the United States with Mexico. And all of this rhetoric, unfortunately, we've gotten used to this gap between what politicians say at one time and to one audience, and what they say later at another time to another audience. And I dare say that most politicians don't even feel embarrassed about that. They simply take it as part of the way that what we call in America retail politics, the politics at the street level, is the way it's conducted. They just have to do that. And the fact that some journalist points this out, who cares? Nobody. How many people actually read and are influenced in their political choices, in their voting, by what some journalist from an elite newspaper says? Very few. So that's really more of an issue for advisors, for and the political context, and of course the diplomats and the people who have to deal with other countries. They're always constantly renegotiating and explaining what the president actually meant and walking backwards. All of these phrases have come to be part of our political lexicon because we can't just simply tell the truth. Our politicians don't do that.
Just to wrap up this session, Nicolai, I want to talk about the Democratic Party. This party was known as a party of peace. Right now, it seems that their policy in Ukraine, in Israel, in Gaza, it's totally different from what we've known from them for so long. And right now, it seems to me that they're losing the progressive part of the party. How do you see the future of this party?
We've lived for decades without important constituencies and large numbers of people who don't vote. I don't know what the statistics are today, but at one point in the 1960s, I believe up to 40% of Americans didn't vote for a variety of reasons that, you can explain them in different ways, but whatever the reason is, they simply decided that the effort to register to vote was not worth it. Who knows what that constituency represents? The constituency that you're talking about is not, I think, crucial to the Democratic Party. It is a fringe constituency on the left. And the Democratic Party is really, in its foreign policy, no different from the Republican Party. I would say that there is a bipartisan war party. By war, I don't mean to say always going to war, but I mean always prepared, if necessary, to spend money on the military-industrial complex that the Republican president, Dwight David Eisenhower, warned us against from giving too much power to. And this constituency is united in its essential perspective that America must lead the world, it must dominate in force of arms, and the fact that America de facto spends as much on its military as the entire rest of the world combined is not the product of any one party or any one administration. It is a reflection of 50 years and more of policies that have entrenched the military-industrial complex in American politics. And I'm not sure there is any solution to this. There's certainly no easy solution to this, and any effort to restrict or limit spending on the military will be fought tooth and nail across the board by whoever is in office, Democrats and Republicans. That is simply now the nature of the American political constituency and the economic interests that support the current structure of politics. Everybody can make money on a growing military industry. And the only argument to make against that, which is made by liberals and people of the left, is, well, wouldn't it be more profitable to spend money in other ways? Which is a purely hypothetical argument, which is to say, don't pocket the money I'm putting into your pocket. Wait, give me that money and I'll give you two later. No, give me the money now. I'd like to spend it now. And so the military-industrial complex gets its way pretty much everywhere. That it insists on support for itself in the American political system, from the very top, the federal level, down to local and regional level. And that's a selling point. Our senator here in the state of Rhode Island is on the Senate military defense committee, and he brings home the bacon. He makes sure that we get contracts here in our area, and that's not something he's shying away from. That's something that he says to make sure that he gets reelected, because those are jobs. We're not thinking of those as war, as incentives for war. We're thinking of them as just jobs that are stable, that are well-paying, that people don't have to drive a long way to. And there's no guarantee that anyone else will build a factory here if a neighboring electric boat goes under or goes through hard times in its military production. So it's all dependent on where the money flows. And I would say both Democrats and Republicans, and probably to a very large extent, even the margins of both parties, understand that. And if they don't understand that, they're not really important in the political discussion.
At the end of the day, what do you see in Ukraine? Are we going to see the same attitude as we saw in Afghanistan? US just leaving the country and letting them with their tremendous problem?
Probably. It's not just Afghanistan. It's a long tradition in American politics. We even have a phrase for it: declare victory and go home. We did it in Korea. We did it in Vietnam. Well, we've done it in pretty much Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere. After a while, we get tired. We may leave some troops as a placeholder in the country, but we have essentially negotiated to accept the status quo. And sometimes, if we can't negotiate a reasonable status quo, as in the case of Afghanistan and in the case of Vietnam, the alternative is not to fight longer, the alternative is to leave. So that is the historical precedent that is the reality of American foreign policy. And that I think all political leaders, both American and foreign, should realize is the most consistent pattern in American foreign policy, and that should be a warning to the wise.